Trench warfare is one of the deadliest forms of warfare, with two armies dug into tough defensive positions, facing off against each other across a scarred killing field. Opposing forces often held their positions for months and even years, gaining little ground while countless soldiers lost their lives. For the last year, I've been building a realistic trench warfare gaming table, and in this video, the table will finally be ready to play on. The project has been split into 3 parts. In the first part, I build a line of trenches, cutting in firing steps and supporting it with revetments and lining it with duckboards and sandbags. In part 2, I created a scarred and terrible no man's land, cutting deep craters, adding a giant destroyed tank, a forest of ruined trees, and over 24 fallen soldiers. In this video, I'm building the third piece, a defensive trench system built into a large hill, and while doing so, we'll learn something of the history of trench warfare. The base of this table section was blocked in months ago while starting the no man's land section, since I needed to make sure the slope of the hill was included in the shape of the center segment. The shape of the hill is made from layers of insulation foam, and after some brief planning, I began to sketch the shape of my fortified emplacement directly onto the foam sections. My intention is to build up a nice ridge here, steep enough to look visually interesting and different from the first trench section, but still gradual enough to be navigable on foot by infantry and also feasible to play wargames on. I went for a dense layout of trenches switchbacking up the hill, which would have its highest point in one corner. Even at this very early stage, looking across the previous sections, you can already see what an advantage an elevated position would grant. The use of trenches in warfare goes back to antiquity, but prior to the 19th century, trenches were used predominantly as an obstacle to disrupt the flow of troops, as shelter in sieges, and to hold down defensive positions. It wasn't until artillery became more commonplace on the average battlefield that it became a good strategy for both sides to dig in. The American Civil War was one of the first conflicts where trench warfare began to emerge in its modern form, as both sides quickly learned the utility of trenches to protect your troops from the new and more advanced weapons like the Gatling gun that were beginning to appear on the battlefield. I was a bit surprised to learn that another culture that were early pioneers of trench warfare were the Maori, who have long built traditional forts called pa that make extensive use of earthworks, trenches, and dug-in storage shelters. These were used particularly effectively in the New Zealand War between 1845 and 1872. Trench warfare persists today as well, and much footage from contemporary wars shows that trenches have lost none of their relevance on the modern battlefield. It seems likely to me that digging trenches is a natural response to certain battlefield conditions that would develop spontaneously anywhere in the world. In any event, the practice of digging widespread trenches along entire fronts was a new innovation in the First World War, and the consequences were devastating. One of the shocking elements of trenches that remain from that period is their close proximity to the trenches of the opposing side. The forward trenches of each army were uncomfortably close to each other, sometimes even as close as only 25 meters apart. As I look across no man's land on my own table, I get a chilling sense of how uncomfortably close that really is. Because I had already glued down some large foam sheets, I had to cut my trenches into the foam layer, which was harder than it needed to be. In the first installment of this series, I cut my trenches before gluing them down, which is definitely the advisable choice. In the First World War, many trenches were dug into earth, which is relatively easy to dig, but depending on the local geology, some trenches and tunnels were cut into stone. Vimy Ridge, for an example, was an outcropping of chalk, which is a relatively soft but stable rock that allowed for extensive trenches and tunnels to be built with minimal support. So in that spirit, I cut into the foam, creating some trenches that slowly elevate up the slope of the hill. It's important to have a smooth grade. Troops moving along these trenches need to be able to keep their footing after all. The main reason I wanted this section built into a hill was so I could make a dugout, an underground chamber excavated to allow the soldiers somewhere to shelter. To make these subterranean chambers, I cut into the hillside, which will leave these areas viewable in cross-section when the project is finished. This should add a really cool dynamism to the table and provide a really interesting feature. To cut the entrances into these dugouts, I cut a vertical trench in the foam all the way through, then cut the removed piece into the right shape to form a steep and narrow stairwell before placing each piece to close it in. I'm going to leave the top of this as a separate piece, which will make it easier to access. With the rough shape of the hill in place, I cut and bevel some of the chunks of foam to give the whole piece a cohesive and gradual slope. There will be some areas that are shored up with revetments and sandbags, so it doesn't need to all be the same, but I wanted it to have some level of organic consistency. Once this is done, I use some aluminum foil to fill in the large gaps, giving the hills a gradual but still lumpy and uneven shape. I also began to pile up the tinfoil around the edges of the trench where the earth would be cashed up with shovels after being dug out when the fortifications were made. As I did this, I went through a huge amount of aluminum foil, and I was struck with a real sense of irony. When I was a kid, I have a vivid memory of making a paper airplane out of aluminum foil while visiting my grandmother, and she scolded me pretty fiercely for wasting foil. She told me that when she was a little girl during World War II, they used to even peel the foil off the back of gum wrappers and collect it to help with the war effort during World War II. I found some cool old advertisements calling for civilians to salvage everything from old rags to bones and fat to steel and tin scrap to help with the war effort.
Letters from Daisy, letters from Jack. Don't be lazy, tie them in a stack. Broken pails, kettles and grids, rusty nails, saucepan lids. The things you used to throw away can live to fight another day. And they're more quickly in the fight if, first of all, you sort them right.
I thought it was a cool bit of history and a good reminder of the far-reaching effects of a global war, even on civilians far from the front lines. If you're interested in war history, you may enjoy the sponsor of today's video, War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive combat game ever made, allowing you to take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and other vehicles from the 1920s until today. With a community of over 70 million players, the PVC experience is unmatched for fans of military history. The vehicles are not simply boxes with hit points. Every vehicle is intricately modeled down to its individual components, like engines, fuel tanks, weapons, and crew, all susceptible to damage or disabling from enemy fire, and different types of armor, shells, and missiles behave like their real-world counterparts. Personally, I think it might be the most sophisticated vehicle damage models in gaming, and it's one of my favorite features. War Thunder is available for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox, so sign up today with the link in the pinned comment or in the video description. New and returning players that haven't played in 6 months will also receive a massive bonus pack that includes multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account. It's available for a limited time only, so be quick. Thanks War Thunder for sponsoring this video. As crafting materials go, I actually quite like working with tinfoil. You can press it into any shape you like, and it has a nice rough texture after. It's relatively lightweight, and a bit of hot glue sticks it down nicely. As you can see, I used it to smooth out the floors of some of the trenches that I cut into the foam, and it did the job admirably. For the corner of the table where the dugouts are, I used some wooden cubes to act as pegs to keep the removable top of the hill in a consistent position. I start by placing the cubes, pressing them into the foam to outline their position, then cutting into the surface to glue them in place about halfway recessed into the foam. I lined up the top piece, then pressed down firmly to make some corresponding indents into the top half. Once those recesses were cut, the piece slots in seamlessly and won't slide out of place, but is still easy to remove. Nice. With the foil work done and dusted, it's time to take this thing outside and apply the first coat of the mud that will make everything look like excavated earth. If you've been following this project from the start, you might now be familiar with this mixture. I combined caulking, brown house paint, sand, powdered tile grout, and a bit of rubbing alcohol to thin it down. This forbidden batter is then mixed until relatively uniform in consistency, then I drizzle it generously on the whole table, spreading it around and pushing it into the cracks with a large paintbrush. Because I did this on a hot day in the direct sun, it was actually forming a dry skin pretty quickly, so I had to work fast. I coated everything, including the insides of the dugouts. This stage is transformative, and you can see now it's really starting to look like real earthworks. Up to this point, the process had been relatively fast, but it's in the next steps where we'll add a ton of realism and detail and where much of the time is spent. The first step is to add the revetments, the supports that hold back the earth of the trench walls. Much like in part 1, I'll be using some corrugated paper, which I paint with some grey primer and silver spray paint to get a nice worn corrugated metal appearance. Learning from my previous mistakes, this time I painted both sides of the paper. I worked around the project, applying this corrugated sheeting to the trench walls, measuring out the fit with a pencil, then cutting each piece to shape. These were then stuck in place with hot glue. Because this section is dug into a hill, some of the trenches are significantly deeper on one side, and so to vary the appearance of the revetments, I added some revetments constructed with planking, which I used some coffee stir sticks for. These planking areas were added to the upper section of certain walls with the sheet metal added after to create a nice overlap and a quite sophisticated look. In the comments of my first trench section video, a lot of people expressed the thought that I should have made the trenches look more makeshift and ramshackle. And indeed, I did encounter some trenches that look this way in reference photos. But trenches varied greatly in construction and quality, and I want this trench board to reflect a front where both sides have been stuck in a vicious stalemate for quite a long time. While the initial trenches may have been rougher in construction, over time they would be improved and fortified. They had no shortage of skilled carpenters, builders, and engineers, and the more regular and built-up style I chose is a better reflection of the massive scale and organization that goes into trench warfare, in my opinion. Still, for a varied appearance, some walls were reinforced entirely with planks, while others were supported entirely with sheet metal. A bit of variance adds a lot of character. I used some brown paint to dull down the color of the wood planks I applied, making them look darker and more weathered, like they'd been splattered with the earth and dust thrown up from shells and left in the elements for months. Next, I'm going to shore up my revetments with some wooden stakes, and again, I have the chance to apply a learning lesson from the first section. Before putting the stake in place, I took them outside in a cardboard box and pre-painted them, using some brown spray paint from the army painter. This is going to save me a huge headache painstakingly painting them later. I went around the board applying these stakes to the corners. This gives a more detailed and intentional look to everything, but also has the added benefit of protecting the corners of these paper revetments. Since this section is supposed to represent a more reinforced and built-up defensive position, I knew I had to add an absolute ton of sandbags. So I developed a new method of making sandbags that's more efficient, more detailed, and faster than my previous technique. I start by mixing up some 2-part epoxy sculpt putty, which is one of my favorite crafting materials. By the way, all of the materials I use on this build will be available to buy on my website through affiliate links, which I'll link in the video description below. With my putty mixed up, I start by rolling some thin snakes, then laid them out on my cutting mat. When working with putty, I always like to keep a bit of lotion on the back of my hand to keep things from sticking where I don't want. So with a well-lotioned craft blade, I use the back of the knife to score a seam along the tube of putty. Then, with a well-lubricated and sharp blade, I cut the putty into little sandbag shapes. The cutting squishes them into little pillows, and with the seam on the side still visible, you get a nice bit of extra detail. I made a few stacks of sandbags right on my cutting mat, then transferred these to the piece. After that, I began applying individual bags. Lots and lots and lots of them. I shored up some unsupported areas of dirt, and also reinforced the areas behind the revetments. Where there was a large gap behind the revetments, I put a small amount of putty down first, just to use fewer sandbags. Because the putty bags squish into each other, you get a really realistic appearance that makes the sandbags look natural and like they have a real weight to them. I didn't count how many sandbags I made and applied this way, but it was easily in the hundreds. I'm not too fussed that these sandbags are a little bit different than the ones I have on the opposing battle line, because after all they're two opposing forces, so I'm sure they have different methods and supply lines. With the sandbags done, it was time to add the duckboards to the bottom of the trenches. In the first video, I switched from using wooden stir sticks to using PVC board because it was easier to cut. But since then, I bought this miniature table saw which allows me to cut a bunch of identical length boards very easily. So I began cutting a ton of little planks and assembled duckboard sections to lay into the trench. Duckboards were a crucial component of trenches because they kept soldiers' feet out of the mud, helping to prevent against trench foot, a painful condition that occurs from having cold and wet feet for too long. During World War I, over 20,000 British troops were treated for trench foot, and while having duckboards lining the trench wouldn't eliminate this risk, it was certainly better than standing in cold mud and water for prolonged periods of time. With a large number of duckboards of various thicknesses built, I took the sections outside and spray painted them, which will save a lot of painting time later. I brought the duckboards back inside and cut them to length, then glued them to the trench floors. I also laid in planks along the firing steps, gluing these directly to the board. In some areas, I glued planks down directly as well. In some tricky places where I needed to make two angles of duckboards joined together, I used PVC board because the stir sticks are very difficult to cut on an angle without them just becoming a splintery mess. Once painted, they're nearly indistinguishable from the wooden boards. To smooth out the board edges, I applied spackle, then once dry, I sanded this smooth. With some black primer, I painted the edges, making the cross-section effect really come to life. I painted all of the sandbags with an off-white color that wasn't actually much different from the color of the putty, but the paint had a matte finish that looks much better. With that done, I covered the whole board in a dirty wash of black paint and water to bring out some of the depth and detail in the mud areas and to tie all the elements together. To really hammer home the nature of this section as a tough defensive position, I built a ton of knife rests using bamboo skewers. These frames were then painted brown and clad with some scale razor wire from the army painter. I wrapped the wire around a paintbrush handle to give it the look of having been deployed from a large reel, then wrap it around the knife rest, making a nice piece of movable cover and scatter terrain. With those finished, I put them around the table wherever I think they might look good, and this table is ready for war. This is the first full-size battlefield I've ever made, and I'm really excited with how it looks. Having every square inch of the table detailed really takes the immersion to the next level. It's incredibly fun to get down at table level and admire the project, imagining yourself looking out over this battlefield. This project has been a long haul to get to this point. Making hundreds of sandbags and hand-cutting revetments and duckboards is a long and labor-intensive process, but it all feels worth it to see it come together. There are still many elements on this board that I intend to finish in the future, such as adding details to the inside of the dugout areas, adding personal items like shovels, ammo crates, and ladders to the inside of the trenches, and adding muddy water to the craters. Make sure you guys are subscribed so you don't miss the next and final installment. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Play it for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox by using my link in the pinned comment or video description. New and returning players that haven't played in 6 months will also receive a bonus pack, including multiple premium vehicles and other good stuff. Available for a limited time only, so don't miss it. I want to give a huge thank you to all of my patrons for all of your support, and thank you for watching this video. We'll see you next time on Eric's Hobby Workshop.